welcome to everybody who just came. We were just talking about the big immigration time of the Jews of Eastern Europe to America. How probably most of our families got here. In the period of time from the late 1800s, about, I have it written down, I want to give you the right information. 1899 to 1914 were the dates of the large immigration, with the largest spikes being following a very massive, very violent pogrom that occurred in Kishinev, in which 45 people were killed, thousands were wounded, many, many women were raped, and more than 1,500 Jewish shops and homes were destroyed in that pogrom. When we think of a pogrom, often we think of it happening in the little villages. The Cossacks would come riding through, a la Fiddler on the Roof style, but this pogrom happened in Kishinev, which was a city. It was a city. It was a fair-sized city where people lived that were just, the masses came through and attacked their Jewish neighbors in Kishinev. Following that pogrom, that also emboldened and pogroms gained in momentum all throughout Eastern Europe, with particularly violent pogroms happening, perpetrated by the Cossacks. The one in Kishinev was the Cossacks, but also the police and just the everyman. In the villages, mostly it was the Cossacks who would come running through. They also would rile up the non-Jewish side of the shtetl. Usually in shtetl means a village, and throughout Eastern Europe it was very common that the Jews would be on one side of town and the Christians on the other side of town. And in the middle was a town square where they did business with each other. Very common, buying this one's milk and that one's cloth, and they did business with each other. They knew each other in those small towns, but the Cossacks would rile up and indeed would distribute money to the non-Jews for their aid in raiding the Jewish villages, which was a concerted effort of the Tsar. It was the Tsar deliberately inspired the Cossacks to do the pogroms.
I know I'm ignorant about this. Who were the Cossacks?
They were the Russian army. They were a division. They were a division of the Tsar's army. They were referring to Cossacks were the horse. They were the cavalry. They were the cavalry. They rode horses.
And who was the Tsar at that time?
The Tsar was Nicholas.
They hung the whole family, right? Nicholas?
They did. They ended
The
up
whole family.
They ended up killing the whole family of the Tsars in the Russian Revolution.
I think my grandfather left because they wanted to induct him into the army.
Yes, that's right.
Mine did too. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, and his brothers ran away because they wanted to draft them. And when they drafted the Jewish boys into the army, they were there for 20 years. It was not just, oh, you're in the army for 4 or 5 years. 20-year commitment. So if they took a young man, 16, 17, 18 years old, that was a lifetime. That was the prime of their life. They were, and not only were they, while they were conscripted, they had a concerted effort to drum the Judaism out of them and assimilate them to Russian life. There was no kosher food. Many of these, all of these young men came from kosher homes. It was unheard of that you wouldn't be kosher in those days. You could certainly not observe the Shabbat, and everyone observed the Shabbat. It was unheard of that you would not, observe the Shabbat. They would literally drum the Jewishness out of them, make them into Russian soldiers, and many of them did assimilate and succumb to that. And on the heels of the Russian Revolution, the great socialist revolution, which in the end did do away with the nobility, the Tsar's family were killed, and Russia became a communist state, and that many Jews became communists. At any rate, in the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, more than 1.5 million Jews came to America in that period of time between 1899 and 1914. Remember, Palestine was a rough and tumble country. We talked about that in my other class, about how there were, the hardy Zionists who decided they were gonna go and be the pioneers in the land of Israel, but it was uncivilized. What was America known as? The Golden and Medina. People knew, here, you could pick up gold from the streets. Now, the truth is that, as we all know, after working all our lives, you can't pick up gold from the streets. However, what you could do was, with hard work, with industry, with determination, you could make something better of yourself and for your children. And many of those first-generation immigrants, their focus was building something for their families so that their children would have a better life. And the big, huge difference is that racism, anti-Semitism, all those things still existed in America, but there were no pogroms. It was not, it was, there was a Constitution of the United States which guaranteed, freedom and equality for all Americans. And even with incidences of anti-Semitism, nonetheless, you could make a life in America and you could prosper in America, as we all know. And I think, we all are the beneficiaries of, ultimately. But the sacrifices that the early, the immigrants from Eastern Europe made were hard. Has anybody here was anyone here an immigrant at one time? Come to America, first generation American immigrant? Anyone in the room? So I tried to live in Israel. My husband and I moved to Israel when we were newlyweds. It was so difficult. It was so difficult on so many levels. It was like 1985. It was so difficult because we spoke a little Hebrew, not fluently. We couldn't find jobs. We didn't have enough of language to find jobs. We had to go to Opan and learn the language. We didn't have enough money. Our families were here, which I missed my family terribly. And it was hard to navigate a new system and figure out where to go and what to do and, how to be.
So what made you decide to go?
Well, we were idealists. We were, Zionist idealists. I still am. I'm just an idealist here from the comfort of America.
Did you have to go to an absorption?
Yes, we had to go to absorptions, and Israel is very good about trying to absorb immigrants. Here,
My heart is in the east, but I am in the midst of the west.
right.
What is
That's
absorption?
right.
What are we talking about?
Absorption is learning how to live in a new society, being absorbed into the new culture, new society.
They have a-
Culture is a very difficult thing.
And they have a program for it.
Yeah.
In Israel, they have a program for it. Here, we do not have programs for that. We do not have acculturation. Absorption is acculturation and assimilation. And what we have now is certainly better than what we had then in 1906, when there weren't even laws that children had to go to school. Nowadays we have laws, children have to be in school till 16, and ostensibly they're learning civics and history and things like that in the classroom that will help them, and English and making friends with different people. Then children did not have to go to school, though Jewish children did go to school. But they're coming, they're speaking Yiddish, they're not knowing English, they're not knowing the language, and they're not, there's not gold in the streets. So where did most people end up? They end up living in the Lower East Side. There were some who pushed westward, who went out west, who went to Chicago, who went to other places in the Midwest to try to, Colorado, actually Denver, there was a thriving Jewish community.
I saw a documentary on Channel 13, of course, some time ago, and there are actually Jewish people that farmed in the South.
Yes, that was just there were some who went to Texas, who came into the United States through Galveston, the port in Galveston, not the port in New York. There were some who came in through the port in Baltimore and ended up going, more to the south, more to the west. Ohio, every city that was established, Jews were going there, but the main concentration of immigrants was the Lower East Side right here in New York. And prior to the Jewish immigration, the Lower East Side was populated, interestingly enough, by Germans, mostly, and also Poles. Now, Poles in Poland were the worst of the anti-Semites. And here they were in New York, living alongside Germans, living alongside Poles, living alongside other people, but the Jewish community in the Lower East Side, the Jews became the major population of the Lower East Side at that time. Has anybody ever been to the Tenement Museum? Great museum. If you have not gone, go. Because it shows how people lived in 2 rooms, literally 2 small rooms, maybe 2 rooms the size of that whole room in half. And 6, 8 people would be living in in 2 rooms like that, with a bathroom in the hall. Here are the Jews on the Lower East Side, and they're all trying to make their way and trying to navigate a new society, living, in America, lots of opportunity, lots of trials and tribulations. It was also a phenomenon.
Yes, you mentioned Rivington Street. I met my wife selling umbrellas in front of the first Romanian American congregation.
Okay. All right, so all of us have, nostalgic memories.
There was also a large Jewish population in Williamsburg.
Well, yes, I'm going to get there. Okay, thank you for bringing that up.
How romantic.
When they built the Williamsburg Bridge, people did go across the bridge to Brooklyn and started with living in, but it wasn't until the Williamsburg Bridge was built that people started to go and live in Williamsburg, and a Jewish population grew in Williamsburg and then throughout Brooklyn.
And up in Harlem. My
Well,
mother-
when
mother
people
was
left the Lower East Side, they went to one of 2 places usually. They either went up to the Bronx, or they went across to Brooklyn. A few went to Queens. That kind of happened a little later. Queens migration happened a little later. Queens migration was the Williamsburg people going out that L line, that the Jackie Robinson, and then you get out and then you're going to Queens. So that was like that Metropolitan Avenue line. So that's a whole different story though, talking about the immigration. I want to stay on topic. So the Jews are trying to cope with a new culture and trying to make their way here. And one of the main key cultural icons, institutions that helped them in their troubles was a newspaper called the Forward. It was in Yiddish. Now it's still, they still actually print it in Yiddish. It's still being printed today. It's online, it's in English, and it's in Yiddish.
I used to buy it for my grandfather in the morning, I think it was 5 cents. I used to go to
Forward and the tug. Remember, he said the forwards and the tug.
And there was one more, because my father was a socialist, okay? And the Freiheit, he had to hide it under his coat. You ever heard of the Freiheit?
Nope.
It was like a socialist, it became like, it was like, they called it a communist. But
All right,
it
so
really
the Forwards was known as
And
being
did you ever
kind
hear
of
the
socialist.
PM? The PM?
No.
You never heard of it? My parents used to get that, and that was considered, they looked, communist paper, socialist.
Well, think of where these people were coming from. They were coming from Eastern Europe, which already was having, through its enlightenment, having ideas of socialism and communism. And that way of life made sense to people because it was all for one for all. Everybody working together for a better life for everyone. That appealed to the Jewish consciousness. Especially people were very poor. I mean, we know, and the stereotype is everybody was poor back there in Europe. They weren't all poor. We've talked about this before. There were people of different classes, of course, but there were a lot of poor people. So they're here. A lot of times husbands came first, find a job, they sent for their wives, they sent for their children, they sent for their parents, trying to scrape the money together. to bring people over. One thing that was different in Jewish immigration was previously, many immigrants came here, made money, and went back, took their money back to Europe. Which they do now. The Jewish community didn't have a go back to go to. They stayed here and they built, they were part of the building of America in that turn of in the beginning of the 20th century. So, although I know there were lots of other newspapers, I'm going to talk about the Forward today because one of the features in the Forward was a column called the Bintel Brief. Everybody knows about it. We're gonna get the Inlanders too. So, Bintel Brief was, what was it about?
Advice.
It was advice. It wasn't a woman answering like Abby, and we're gonna talk about Abby and Ann in a little bit. It wasn't a woman answering, it was the editor of the Forward. His name was Albert Cahan, and it started out because they got tons of letters from people asking for advice. Things like, I want to read you some of the letters. But before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about there's a book about the Bintel Brief, and what it also talked about is not only the stories and answering the advice, but it was always with a little bit of humor, and that the Yiddish humor that was on the Lower East Side helped people to get through difficult times, and I want to read you a little bit of these letters. Because what people did was they would write letters asking for help with their absorption, with their acculturation. So here's the first one. Esteemed editor, I hope that you will advise me in my present difficulty. I am a greenhorn. That was the other. When I was a girl, my grandparents used to say, "Oh, they're a greener." I never knew what that was. Finally, my mother said to me, "They're saying greenhorn," and she'd explain, "What's a greenhorn?"
Why greenhorn? What's the derivation?
Because a greenhorn, like when you have a buck in the forest, their first antlers are green. They're new.
And then they change
They're
color?
new. It's a baby. You're a babe in the woods. Yeah, greenhorns. You're green. You don't know what you're doing. So only 5 weeks in the country and a jeweler by trade. I come from Russia, where I left a blind father and a stepmother. Before I left, my father asked me not to forget him. I promised that I would send him the first money I earned in America. When I arrived in New York, I walked around for 2 weeks looking for a job, and the bosses told me it was after the season. In the third week, I was lucky and found a job at which I earned $8 a week. That was a lot of money back then. I worked, I paid my landlady board, I bought a few things to wear, and I have a few dollars in my pocket. Now I want you to advise me what to do. Shall I send my father a few dollars for Passover, or should I keep the little money for myself? In this place, the work will end soon, and I may be left without a job. The question is how to deal with the situation. I will do as you tell me. And all these letters to Bintel Brief, they all very often end like that. I will do as you tell me. Your thankful reader, I am. So what's the answer?
Send him half.
Half, yeah.
How about half?
No, it says the answer to this young man is that he should send his father the few dollars for Passover, because since he is young, he will find it easier to earn a living than would his blind father in Russia. That's the answer.
You know what this is like? This is like the Chabad, like with the rabbis. I'll do
Aaron, you're
whatever the
ahead of
rabbi-
me. So I was just.
I'm sorry.
I'm glad. When your students get the big picture, that's great. So what Aaron's talking about is something called responsa. And that still exists today in Orthodox communities, especially in the Hasidic communities. When somebody has a question, a concern, a worry, they write to the rabbi. And people would write to rabbis all over the world, from here to there, to this great rabbi, miles away. It would take months to get the answers back. The rabbi would give the answer back. People displaced in America who were also finding that religion had to go by the wayside to a large degree. People worked on the Sabbath. You had to, there was non-kosher food available for everyone, and it was maybe cheaper. You had to do what you need, you had to learn English. You didn't have time to go to synagogue. You didn't have time to sit and learn. People were hustling, and they were letting their religion go. Plus, if they lived in this shtetl, and they always listened to this rabbi in that shtetl, where is that rabbi? He's still back in Europe. Who do I go to? In this brave new world, this new America, I go to the forward. So it's exactly that. That is the tradition of asking the rabbi. Instead, they ask the forward. So here's the next question. Dear editor, I hope that you will give me the opportunity to tell the world about my sufferings. 2 years ago, when I was barely 19, I left my home in a small town in Russia. I had read many books that stimulated my imagination, and I dreamed of becoming a countess, or at least a millionaire. After father died, my mother received a letter from his brother in America saying that since he heard times were bad for us, he wanted me to come to him. Later, he would also bring my mother over. He wrote that he was wealthy, and with him I would live like a princess. My mother and I agreed that I should go to the rich uncle, and I left for America. From the day I arrived, my uncle was very good to me. When I entered the world of luxury, I felt that all of my dreams were coming true. His wealth and indulgence excited me, and as I now recall, I didn't care that he was becoming more and more familiar in his attitude to me. I didn't even feel misgivings when my uncle became more intimate with me or when he seduced me. Any regrets I had were submerged in my infatuation, and I became his constant mistress. About 8 or 9 months ago, a young couple came from New York to the town where my uncle lives. Since the man had a brother in town, a man with whom my uncle had business dealings, I became acquainted with the young couple. The man was handsome, polite, decent, and my uncle thought highly of him. The only thing against him was that he spoke like a socialist. One day when the man was at our house, my uncle suggested he become my tutor. He remarked that I was still very green and knew very little English. The young man became my tutor, and I am not ashamed to say I cherished the opportunity to spend time with him. The man interested me more than his English and his whole education. In time, however, his good manners and polite attitude awakened in me an interest in learning. He taught me not only English, but an understanding of life and man's struggle for justice. He helped me understand the meaning of socialism. His sweet wife, too, became my teacher, and I learned a great deal from both of them. But hear how I repaid them for their kindness. I realized I was pregnant. I told my uncle I was to become a mother, and to my astonishment, he answered cold-bloodedly that something would be done about it. I didn't want to undergo such a criminal operation, and I told him I would tell everyone the truth. He said, "Fool, who would believe you?" He was a prominent man and a trustee in the synagogue. Soon he came up with another suggestion. He would say I was seduced by my tutor. This is a long letter, but it's a good one. Naturally, I could not agree to the vile proposal to smear the good name of such a decent and innocent person. My uncle ignored me, however, and carried out his evil plan. He declared that the man was never to come to his house again because I had said he had seduced me. I had neither the opportunity nor the courage to clear the innocent man, and I was tormented. One day, the young man forced his way into my uncle's house, and from my rooms I heard him shouting that I should confront him before everybody and say he was guilty. I started toward the room with the impulse to cry out that he was innocent, and I wanted to tell everyone of my uncle's wickedness, but I was so overcome by emotion that I fainted. The same day, I was taken to the hospital in critical condition and lost the baby, and thus because of me was a decent, good man's reputation sullied. When I left the hospital, I did not return to my rich uncle. I live alone now, lonely and poor. My aim in life is to announce to the world who was guilty in my misfortune and to clear the name of my good teacher. Maybe I'll have the chance to fall at his feet and beg for her forgiveness. I beg you to publish my letter in the name of the innocent man. Sincerely, H.P. So what do you think the forward answer to her?
Why don't you put a name down?
They always put their initials down.
Oh.
That's a very common format, that they put their initials down. So the forward says to her, we write this letter primarily in interests of the innocent young man. If the letter writer's uncle is really as she pictures him, he is one of the most degenerate creatures on earth. Nevertheless, the writer of this letter should never have allowed the false accusation to be made against the young man. That's what they write. The point is that
The English that this letter writer is using does not sound like a green.
right, she
Like
doesn't
an
sound like
immigrant.
she, but these are, I should say, these are translations of Yiddish. People wrote in Yiddish.
Okay. Well, they're very, I mean, it's a beautifully written letter.
So, but these are the kinds of things, let me read one more to you.
That's why she could write.
Since I have been a forward reader for the early days, I hope you will allow me to unburden my heart and the Bintel brief. People use the Bintel brief as a way to unburden to get absolution for things that they had done that they thought were wrong, to get advice, practical advice, like should I send the money back, should I send keep half, what should I do? They trusted the guidance of the forward.
Is there still a Bintel brief? Because I have problems.
There might be, I don't know.
Today
The
it's
next
a cheap
letter-
one. Today it's called a therapist.
Today it's called a therapist. The next letter is about a woman whose husband, she has 7 children. Her husband becomes sick with something they called consumption. Consumption in those days was tuberculosis. The doctor said he should go to Colorado where the air was good. And I don't know if any of you who took my class a while ago when we talked about Golda Meir and the clinic in Colorado, and there were many Jews with consumption went to this clinic because they were the high mountain air, the altitude was good. He went to Colorado and he became a peddler in Colorado. Eventually he sent for his wife and children, but then he did end up passing away in Colorado, and she didn't know what to do. She's a widow with 7 children, small children, alone in Colorado. So, things like that. People wrote asking for advice, and the Bintel Brief was an institution that lasted, if it's not in existence today, which it may be still in existence today. We've got to Google it. It was in existence well into the 1960s, 70s, 80s. So people, and as immigrants became more and more used to American life, the questions became different, the language became different, and it had to do with different issues. Because it didn't take very long for the Jewish community who came to the United States to get their kids into college. We had CUNY here in New York, which was a free college education, or basically free. You needed your book money, you needed very cheap.
Just registration money.
You needed a little bit of money, but it was cheap enough that scores and scores of Jewish immigrants went to Brooklyn College, Hunter College, City College, and got a first-rate education, and were able to go on to medical school, to law school, to business, to teaching, and to really raise themselves out of that of the ghetto and build life in America. So one of those families was a family called, and I have to remember the last name, were the Friedmans. The Friedmans were a Jewish immigrant family, left Russia in 1903, right after that Kishinev pogrom, but rather than go to New York, they had relatives in Sioux City, Iowa. And they went to Sioux City, Iowa, and the father was a peddler, like everybody was a peddler. Eventually he had a shop, and he had 2 twin girls. Twin girls whose names were Esther Pauline Friedman and Pauline Esther Friedman. That's what what they named their 2 daughters. So the first one, Esther Pauline, her nickname was Epi, Pauline Esther, her nickname was Poppy. And the two of them were close as can be, twin sisters. And they grew up together, went to high school together, they're tightest friends. When they married, they each made good matches for themselves. Pauline married a very wealthy businessman. Eppie was introduced to a friend of Pauline's, a guy named Jules not Landers, it was Letterman, Jules Letterman. They had a joint wedding that was the society wedding of Sioux City, Iowa. They had matching wedding gowns. More than 700 people were in attendance, and they had 22 people in their bridal party. Huge wedding. The parents did well in Sioux City, Iowa. The girls made good matches, and they were still very close. They went off to live in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, because Poppy's husband hired Eppie's husband to work with him in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. But then then Eppie's husband got a job. He started out selling hats. He eventually built up the budget rent-a-car business. The other one's also, her husband, very wealthy, and they split, and Eppie went to Chicago, and Pauline went to San Francisco. So they were society women. The fur coats and the Cadillacs, both of them with their own husbands and their own lives. Very active, both of them, in the Democratic Party. For Jewish causes, they volunteered, part of Hadassah, they were part of Anti-Defamation League, the B'nai B'rith. They did a lot of community work. But one day, Eppie, AKA Esther, decided, she wanted something more to do with her life. And through a connection, she at the newspaper in Chicago, at the Tribune, she inquired about maybe becoming an assistant to the woman who wrote the Ann Landers column. It just so happened that a week before she called, that woman, her name was Ruth Crowley, had passed away, and they were looking for a replacement to write Ann Landers' column. So they had lots of applicants, but Eppie beat them all out. What they did was they gave each applicant a set of letters to answer, and because Eppie was so connected, she was a society woman, she knew Justice Thurgood, she knew all these society people that she asked advice from for her letters. So when she answered, she said, well, one of them was a question of one of the neighbors, two neighbors, one has a walnut tree, part of the branches of the walnut tree go into the yard, the nuts that fall in my yard, can I use those nuts? Or, the nuts that are over in my yard, are those my walnuts, or do they belong to my neighbor? So actually there's a legal answer for that, and Eppie found it she asked Thurgood Marshall, and she wrote in her article, Thurgood Marshall says that you can use it for your own personal use, but you cannot sell the walnuts. That was the, so needless to say, the editor was impressed, and he hired her. She wrote letters from then until, I want to say, she passed away in 2002, and she continued to write her Ann Landers column, literally from, it was 1938, I think, until, 1938 until 2002.
Wow.
She died at 87, she had multiple myeloma, she died at 87, and she continued to write her article, her letter. She had one child, a girl named Margot, and Margot did join her and help her as she grew older, and she was very renowned. Her column, Ann Landers' column, was read by more than 90 million people all around the world. Many editions, and still today you can go online and find Ann Landers' advice online. Now, here's her twin sister on the other side. here's where it gets interesting. So Anne is very successfully writing this column in Chicago. Her sister is in San Francisco. Their husbands' work took them to these places. And her sister, Poppy, decides, you know what? Eppie's doing this in Chicago. I'm going to do it here in San Francisco. And she goes to the newspaper in San Francisco, very similarly story, although famously it said that she arrived for her job interview in a Cadillac and in a Dior dress. But she made the chauffeur wait around the block from the building, that they wouldn't know that she came by chauffeur. And she also was given letters to answer. The impressed. They both were college educated. They went to the same college in Sioux City, Iowa, called Morningside College. She also answered and got the job. Now, both women had, twins, like this, okay? When Eppie, AKA Ann Landers, found out that her sister, Poppy, AKA Abigail Van Buren, which she took the names Abigail Van Buren from, one, the biblical Abigail, and two, President Van Buren. She just made up that name. Dear Abby, she was upset. She said, why didn't you tell me you were going to do this? Now we're competing, because she said, well, we're not competing. You're in Chicago, I'm in San Francisco. But what happens with newspapers, and in those days, that was the heyday of the newspaper world, syndication. Syndication, they're all over. And so they ended up being in direct competition with each other. They fought bitterly about it. And they ended up not speaking to each other. There's different sources I read. Some say 5 years, some say 7 years, some say 10 years. They didn't speak to each other for years, let's suffice it to say. Sisters who had been peas in the pod. They were so angry with each other over nonsense, but they were both competing with each other. No newspaper is going to take both Ann Landers and Dear Abby. I mean, it was very similar. Ann Landers was known for giving longer, a little more thoughtful answers to questions posed to her, whereas Abby was known for being kind of a stick-it-to-ya with the
She used to come
with
out
the
with
wry
those,
humor.
yeah.
She used the wry humor. In fact, let's see if I have it. It was in the handout. I was going to
Yeah.
give you.
One hand
They could have solved their problems by writing to the Bintel brief.
By the way, both of them did speak Yiddish. They did, and in fact, when they were close, they were famous for, at parties, singing Andrew's Sisters songs in Yiddish. They translated the Andrew's Sisters songs into Yiddish, and they would do, they would sing the Yiddish songs, and they had a whole shtick. So they fought bitterly, but they had been very close. And Abby was known for her sharp wit, which was kind of a derivation of that Yiddish humor. For instance, and I don't have it with me, it was on a handout I was going to give you that somehow didn't get done. But at any rate, there was a letter somebody once wrote to Dear Abby that said, Dear Abby, I'm going to paraphrase with my memory of it. In the house across from us, a gentleman and his adopted son, ostensibly adopted son, bought the house. Now, there are people coming at all hours of the night, and sometimes we see men dressed as women going in and out of that house. We really feel that this is dragging down the value of our neighborhood. There's too much going on there, parties, etc. What can we do to preserve the value of our neighborhood? And what was Abby's response? Move. You could move. So from early on, from the 50s into modern times where these columns kept going, both of these women actually, they were known to be liberal. They were pro-choice, feminist. They advocated for gay rights in a time when, in the 50s, that was novel in the 60s and onward. The 50s they did get a lot of housewife and, housewives writing into both, each one of them, asking their husbands were cheating on them, there's infidelity, what should I do? And very often, Anne would recommend that the woman suck it up, basically, and preserve her marriage at all costs. Abby, on the other hand, was a little more liberal and advocated for some different responses. One time when a teenager wrote to Ann Landers about making out and, going a little too far as teenagers, Ann Landers wrote back to her and said, well, my dear, a lemon that's been squeezed is thrown in the garbage, or is considered So, they ended up being, we can laugh at their humor, but in truth, all of us know them, and beyond this room, everybody knows them.
Yes.
They really influenced American society. Their advice and their, the things that they wrote really influenced.
Was their real identity known all the time that they were writing, or they just columnists that?
It wasn't a secret that those were pen names, and in fact, there was a big Life magazine article that came out in the late 1950s about their rivalry, and it was a scandal at the time. It was a scandal at the time.
Okay, since I like feel-good stories, did they get back together?
Well, so yes, they got back together because one day Anne decided she had enough of fighting with her sister. She missed her sister, and she called her up and she said, let's bury the hatchet. I don't even know what we're fighting about anymore. You have your thing, I have my thing. We should both be successful. Let's go on vacation together. And with their husbands, the four of them went on vacation to Bermuda. They spent 2 good long weeks in Bermuda, had a great time, and after that they were friends again forever. Now, Anne, actually, after 36 years, her husband Jules and she divorced. So this was in 1972, I think? 1978. So 1978, people were getting divorced. It was common, but it still had some stigma attached to it. And she actually wrote about her divorce in her column and how it was going and how she felt about it and that her husband was, what was happening. It's famously known that Ann Landers received 30,000 letters of support when she wrote about her own travails.
Didn't he marry the secretary?
He did marry the secretary. They were married for 36 years. And it's said that she was so in love with him and loved being his wife that in her fur coats, of which she had many apparently, she had embroidered, how some people have their initials or their name embroidered. Her embroidery inside her fur coat said Jules's wife.
Very sad.
Anne. And you know what? Both of them
He
were
left her
beautiful
because
women.
of the secretary?
Yeah, he had an affair with the secretary and left her.
What else?
After 36 years.
I think when you say Jews went to Brooklyn, there were certain areas they went, certain areas.
Yes, that's
Flatbush, Brownsville, East New York, certain
Canarsie,
areas.
eventually, they went from East New York to Canarsie, yes.
Right.
That's the way migration, that's actually a great lecture for a whole other thing, to look at how the Jews spread out from New York. But it all started really in that little heart in the Lower East Side. And taking an approach to look at life's problems from a different lens, from kind of looking for a solution rather than a hopelessness, looking for a way out, for an answer, laced with humor, laced with a little sarcasm, laced with an appreciation that life's not easy, life can be hard, and so you need a little dose of that sometimes to get by. And people really, did anybody here ever write to Dear Abby or Ann Landers? No. I think people have always been looking for the outside, looking for answers. And when that smaller village, tighter knit community starts to stretch and expand and be dissolved, people need an anchor. And also there's something I think attractive about the anonymity of writing and you leave your initials, or you say Amy in Staten Island, or something like that, so that people, there's a certain degree of anonymity that you, and also a certain degree of feeling relief at just writing it down and sending it off, right? So here's a couple of classic Ann Landers. Dear Ann Landers, I have been married for 3 years, and it is obvious that my mother does not like my wife. I can deal with that, but I'm becoming increasingly upset by the way Mom behaves around, quotes, Amelia. 2 weeks ago, there was a milestone family affair, and we hired a professional photographer to take pictures. As we were preparing to pose for the photo shoot, my mother informed Amelia that she could not be in the pictures because she was not a blood relative and therefore not a family member. My wife stepped down and she was very hurt. There have been other instances as well. One evening, when several of us went to the theater together, Mom happened to end up sitting next to Amelia. She abruptly stood up, moved to the other side of the row, and announced, "I want to sit next to my son." I have asked my mother politely to stop treating Amelia so shabbily, but she insists she has nothing against my wife and accuses me of being overly sensitive. I hope you can help me. Signed, not Mama's boy in Missouri. So here's what Ann writes to him. Dear Missouri, your signature does not match your letter. You certainly sound like a mama's boy to me, and a gutless one at that. Why did you not speak up on your wife's behalf when your mother decided Amelia couldn't be in the family pictures because she isn't a blood relative? And when your mother demanded to sit next to you in the theater, why didn't you arrange it so the seating so that your wife would be on the other side? As long as you permit your mother to abuse Amelia, she is going to do it. It's high time you asserted yourself, sonny boy. Check out the Bible, which says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh." Copy that directive on a piece of paper and tape it to your bathroom mirror. So that's the kind of thing that she wrote.
I think the man's name was Meltzer.
Oh, on the radio?
Okay.
Okay. So, I think that, in today's lecture, it's interesting to note the influence of kind of a very ingrained Jewish cultural phenomenon, that of writing responsa to the rabbi to get advice, to get answers back, translated to the New World, both in the immigrants' experience at the turn of the century and on into modern times. And today, I think people still are looking for answers all the time. So,
He was on for a long time, and he would give financial advice, just like Miss Ann Landers. But now it's in the advance, they have that.
yeah, it's still going on. Oh,
Yeah.
before I answer, I should tell you two things. Anne had a daughter, Margot. Abby had a daughter, Jean. Margot and Jean, to this day, do not get along.
Oh.
And they kind of took over their mother's, when their mothers reconciled, they did not. They have a lot of animosity towards each other, and then each one of them writes a advice column for different papers today. They took over in their mother's footsteps. Jean actually took over Dear Abby. She is Dear Abby Today, which is an online version of Dear Abby, and appears in some newspapers, because Abby got Alzheimer's disease in the late 80s. She started to have Alzheimer's, and Jean wrote the column with her mother for many years, but then as her mother's health deteriorated, Jean took it over. And Margot also writes an etiquette column, and I forget the name of Margot's. It's called Annie's Advice, because when Ann Landers died, she had it in her will that no one could ever take that trademark, Ann Landers' name, and use it again. So, there you go.
Very
Thank you all.
Aaron is late.